2,000 years ago, there were no phones buzzing with notifications, no social media feeds engineered to keep you scrolling, no 24-hour news cycle designed to keep you anxious, no inbox that never empties. So why does philosophy written that long ago still feel like it was written specifically for the problems we face today? The answer is simpler than it might seem. The tools have changed completely, but the underlying human experience, the anxiety, the comparison, the desire for control, the fear of not being enough, that hasn't changed at all. Marcus Aurelius dealt with a version of the same overwhelm you feel scrolling through bad news. Seneca dealt with a version of the same anxiety you feel comparing your life to someone else's. Epictetus dealt with a version of the same need to control things that were never actually his to control. Today, we're going to look at Stoic philosophy specifically through a modern lens, not as ancient history, but as a genuinely practical operating system for dealing with problems that feel distinctly modern, but are, underneath the surface, exactly the problems humans have always faced. We'll cover how Stoic principles apply directly to social media comparison, the anxiety of constant connectivity, information overload, decision fatigue, and the particular kind of modern burnout that comes from trying to do and be everything at once. By the end, you'll see why this philosophy hasn't just survived 2,000 years. It's arguably more relevant now than it's ever been. If this is useful, hit subscribe. It helps this reach more people who need it. Let's get into it. Marcus Aurelius never had to see a curated highlight reel of thousands of other people's best moments. Every single day, delivered directly into his hands. We do, and it's changing something fundamental about how we experience our own lives. The Stoics understood comparison as a mental habit, something that happened occasionally, when you happened to notice someone else's circumstances and measured your own against them. Today, comparison isn't occasional, it's engineered, algorithmic, delivered constantly, specifically designed to keep you engaged by keeping you slightly dissatisfied. Epictetus taught that comparing yourself to others is one of the surest paths to feeling perpetually behind. Because there will always be someone further along on whatever metric you're measuring against. In his time, this meant occasionally noticing a wealthier neighbor. Today, it means an endless stream of curated success, delivered by an algorithm specifically optimized to maximize your engagement, often through subtle, cumulative comparison. Think about scrolling through social media and noticing, almost without realizing it, a small shift in your mood, a slight sense of falling behind. Even though nothing in your actual life changed in the last 10 minutes. That shift is comparison working exactly as the algorithm intends it to work. The Stoic response here isn't necessarily to abandon these tools entirely, though that's certainly one option. It's to apply the same discipline Epictetus taught, but adapted to a much higher frequency environment. The practice of noticing comparison as it happens, and consciously choosing not to let it dictate your internal state. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of returning to your own path, your own reasoned judgment, rather than being pulled off course by constantly measuring yourself against others. This applies with even more force today, given how much more frequently that pulling happens. Consider building a specific practice around this. Before opening any app designed for comparison, pause and remind yourself explicitly, what I'm about to see is curated, incomplete, and designed to trigger comparison. That reminder alone often reduces its emotional impact significantly. Have you noticed that the comparison triggered by social media rarely reflects anything you can actually act on? It's not useful information guiding a decision. It's simply noise, engineered to keep you scrolling, dressed up as information about how your life measures up. So how do you practice Stoic resistance to this modern amplification? First, before engaging with comparison-heavy platforms, remind yourself explicitly what you're about to encounter, and why it's designed to trigger exactly this response. Second, when you notice comparison arising, name it directly. This is comparison, not useful information, rather than letting it operate invisibly in the background of your mood. And finally, consider deliberately limiting exposure to the specific triggers that reliably produce this effect. The same way you'd limit exposure to any pattern that consistently disturbs your peace without providing genuine value in return. Number 2. Every notification arrives with an implicit message. This matters right now, and requires your immediate attention. almost none of them actually do. But the design of modern connectivity has trained most of us to respond as though they do, checking phones within minutes of waking, interrupting focused work for minor notifications, carrying a persistent, low-grade sense of urgency throughout entire days that rarely reflects any genuine emergency. The Stoics had no concept of this specific kind of manufactured urgency. But they had extensive teaching about a closely related problem: the difference between what's actually urgent and important, and what merely feels urgent because of how it's presented to you. Epictetus taught his students to interrogate their sense of urgency directly, asking whether a given concern actually required immediate action, or whether that feeling of urgency was itself the thing worth questioning, separate from the actual content of the concern. Think about how many notifications throughout a typical day genuinely require immediate response, versus how many simply create the feeling of urgency through design: a red notification badge, a sound alert, a visual cue specifically engineered to trigger an immediate checking response, regardless of the actual importance of the content behind it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about maintaining his own reasoned pace, rather than being pulled reactively by every demand for his attention. As emperor, he genuinely had urgent matters requiring immediate attention, and still, he maintained enough internal steadiness to distinguish between what actually required immediate response and what simply presented itself with urgency. Consider applying this distinction to your own relationship with notifications. Before responding immediately to a buzz or alert, pause and ask directly, does this actually require immediate action? Or am I simply responding to the manufactured urgency of the notification itself? This isn't about becoming unreachable or irresponsible. It's about restoring your own judgment as the filter for what deserves immediate attention, rather than outsourcing that judgment entirely to whatever app happens to be demanding it in any given moment. Have you noticed that the anxiety of constant connectivity often has little to do with the actual content of messages, and much more to do with the persistent feeling that something might require your attention at any moment? That anxiety is a direct product of design, not an accurate reflection of genuine urgency in your life. So how do you practice Stoic discernment here? First, build in deliberate delays before responding to non-urgent notifications. Even a short delay breaks the automatic, reactive pattern that constant connectivity trains into most of us. Second, distinguish explicitly, for yourself, between genuinely urgent matters and things that simply feel urgent because of how they're delivered. Most notifications fall into the second category. And finally, consider structuring specific times for checking messages and notifications, rather than remaining perpetually available to every demand for attention throughout your entire day. Number 3. You have access to more information right now, in your pocket, than the entire library of ancient Alexandria contained at the height of its collection. This should, theoretically, make decision-making easier. In practice, it often makes it harder, because unlimited access to information doesn't just provide answers. It also provides unlimited exposure to uncertainty, conflicting opinions, and problems you have no actual ability to solve. The Stoics never faced this specific version of overload, but they had clear teaching about a closely related issue: the difference between information that's actually useful to you, and information that simply creates anxiety without providing any corresponding ability to act. Epictetus taught that concerning yourself with matters outside your control, even informationally, tends to drain energy without producing any benefit. Today, this applies directly to the constant stream of global news, distant crises, and endless debates that, while genuinely important in the abstract, often have no direct connection to anything you can actually influence in your own life. Think about how much daily anxiety comes not from your own immediate circumstances, but from constant exposure to problems, conflicts, and crises happening far outside your sphere of influence. This isn't to suggest ignorance is preferable to awareness, but there's a meaningful difference between being informed and being constantly, anxiously immersed in information you have no capacity to act on. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling an empire with genuine access to information about distant threats and problems, still maintained a clear focus on what was actually within his power to address, rather than allowing every piece of available information to consume his attention equally. Consider applying a filter to your own information consumption. Similar to the dichotomy of control we've discussed before. Is this information something I can act on directly? Or is it something that, however important in the abstract, simply adds anxiety without any corresponding ability to influence it? Have you noticed that unlimited access to information about problems you cannot solve tends to produce a specific kind of helplessness, awareness without agency? Concern without any outlet for action? That combination is particularly draining, precisely because it offers no resolution. So how do you practice Stoic discernment with information overload? First, distinguish between information relevant to decisions you're actually making, and information that simply exists, available, regardless of whether it connects to anything actionable in your life. Second, consider deliberately limiting exposure to information streams that reliably produce anxiety without corresponding ability to act, not out of avoidance, but out of the same energy management the Stoics applied to every other domain. And finally, when you do engage with difficult information, ask directly what, if anything, you can actually do in response. If the answer is genuinely nothing, practice consciously releasing the anxiety, the same way you'd release any other concern outside your control. Number 4. Ancient Rome had relatively few options for most daily decisions. What to eat, what to wear, how to spend leisure time. The choices were genuinely limited compared to what modern life presents. We face something entirely different. Endless streaming options, endless products, endless paths for nearly every decision. From what to watch tonight to what career to pursue. This abundance, counterintuitively, often produces more anxiety than satisfaction, a phenomenon researchers call decision fatigue, but that the Stoics would have recognized under a different name entirely. Epictetus taught that excessive deliberation over matters that don't actually require extensive consideration wastes energy that could be better directed elsewhere. Applied to modern decision fatigue, this suggests a specific practice, recognizing which decisions genuinely warrant careful consideration, and which ones are simply consuming disproportionate mental energy relative to their actual importance. Think about how much daily mental energy goes into decisions that, realistically, have minimal long-term consequence: what to watch, where to eat, which of several similar options to choose. The Stoic principle here isn't that these decisions don't matter at all, but that the energy invested should be proportional to the actual stakes involved. Marcus Aurelius, facing genuinely consequential decisions as emperor, still maintained a clear sense of which matters deserved extensive deliberation and which ones deserved quick, reasonable choices without excessive second-guessing. This proportionality, matching decision-making energy to actual stakes, is directly applicable to modern decision fatigue. Consider implementing a simple practice here. Before a decision, quickly assess its actual stakes. High-stakes decisions, career changes, significant relationships, major commitments, genuinely warrant careful consideration. Low-stakes decisions, what to watch, where to eat, which of several similar products to buy, warrant quick, reasonable choices, made efficiently, without excessive deliberation. Have you noticed that the mental exhaustion from low-stakes decisions often has little correlation with their actual importance? Choosing between similar streaming options can feel surprisingly draining, despite having essentially no long-term consequence either way. So how do you practice this Stoic proportionality? First, explicitly categorize decisions by actual stakes before investing significant mental energy into them. This alone often reveals that many daily decisions deserve far less deliberation than we instinctively give them. Second, for low-stakes decisions, practice quick, reasonable choice-making, setting a mental time limit, and choosing efficiently once that limit is reached, rather than continuing to deliberate indefinitely. And finally, reserve your genuinely careful, extensive deliberation for decisions that actually warrant it, the ones with real, lasting consequences, where the Stoic discipline of careful reasoned judgment genuinely matters. Number 5. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from feeling like you should be simultaneously excelling at your career, maintaining perfect relationships, staying physically fit, pursuing personal growth, managing your finances flawlessly, and staying socially and politically engaged, all at once, all the time. This specific pressure, the sense that a genuinely good life requires excellence across every single domain simultaneously, is a distinctly modern phenomenon. amplified by constant visibility into how other people appear to be managing all of it. At least in their curated presentation. The Stoics offered something genuinely useful here, even though they never faced this exact combination of pressures. Seneca wrote extensively about the cost of trying to be everywhere, do everything, and excel at all of it simultaneously. He said, "The man who is everywhere is nowhere." Attention and energy, spread across too many domains simultaneously, produce mediocrity in all of them rather than excellence in any. Think about the difference between someone attempting to excel equally at career, fitness, relationships, personal growth, and social engagement all at once, versus someone who has deliberately chosen a smaller number of priorities to actually invest deeply in, accepting that other domains will receive less attention during this particular season of their life. Marcus Aurelius, despite his position and its enormous demands, maintained a clear sense of priority, recognizing that his role as emperor, his philosophical practice, and his most essential relationships deserved his focused attention, while other potential pursuits simply had to remain secondary, without guilt attached to that necessary limitation. Consider your own current life, mapped against this modern pressure to excel everywhere simultaneously. How much of your current exhaustion comes not from any single domain being genuinely difficult, but from attempting to give meaningful attention to too many domains at once, none of them receiving the focus they'd actually need to genuinely thrive? Have you noticed that the people who seem most genuinely accomplished in any single domain often appear to have deliberately deprioritized several others? At least temporarily, rather than attempting uniform excellence across everything simultaneously? So how do you practice this Stoic prioritization? First, honestly identify which domains of your life currently deserve your deepest attention, given your actual circumstances and values right now, rather than some idealized version of uniform excellence. Second, consciously accept reduced attention in other domains during this season, without treating that reduction as failure. Seasons change, priorities can shift again later. And finally, redirect the energy previously spent trying to excel everywhere simultaneously toward genuine depth in the areas that matter most right now. Depth in a few domains tends to produce far more satisfaction than shallow attempts at excellence spread across everything at once. Number 6. Every online action now carries a particular kind of permanence that simply didn't exist before: a comment, a post, a mistake, potentially preserved and searchable indefinitely, creating a specific modern anxiety about digital reputation that the Stoics never had to directly confront. But the underlying concern, fear of how others perceive you, anxiety about mistakes affecting your standing, worry about judgment from people who don't know the full context, this is exactly the territory Epictetus addressed directly. Even though the specific mechanism of digital permanence is new, he taught that other people's opinions of you are not within your control, and therefore chasing perfect control over your reputation is ultimately a losing game, regardless of how much energy you invest in managing it. This applies with particular force to digital reputation. Where the illusion of control feels stronger, you can delete a post, but you cannot guarantee it was never seen, screenshotted, or remembered. Think about the specific anxiety of posting something online and immediately worrying about how it will be perceived, judged, or potentially held against you indefinitely. This anxiety, while amplified by modern technology, is fundamentally the same anxiety Epictetus addressed, an attempt to control something that was never fully within your control to begin with. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the freedom available once you genuinely accept that you cannot control universal approval, regardless of how carefully you manage your actions and words. This doesn't mean acting carelessly online. It means accepting that even careful, thoughtful action cannot guarantee universal positive perception, and that chasing that impossible guarantee produces far more anxiety than it prevents. Consider your own relationship with digital reputation. How much energy goes into managing how you're perceived online, versus how much genuine peace that management actually produces? Often, the energy invested in controlling perception exceeds any actual benefit gained, because perfect control was never actually achievable. Have you noticed that the anxiety about digital permanence often exceeds the actual likelihood of any specific post or comment genuinely affecting your life in a lasting way? Most digital content, despite feeling permanently significant in the moment, fades into irrelevance far faster than the anxiety about it would suggest. So how do you practice Stoic acceptance here? First, act thoughtfully online, aligned with your actual values, rather than primarily driven by anxiety about how each action might be perceived or preserved. Second, accept that some degree of misperception or misjudgment is simply unavoidable, regardless of how carefully you manage your digital presence. That acceptance, paradoxically, often reduces anxiety more effectively than attempting perfect control. And finally, redirect energy from managing perception towards simply acting with integrity, trusting that consistent, genuine action matters more, over time, than any single carefully managed post or comment. Number 7. Modern burnout has a particular quality to it, not just physical exhaustion, but a specific kind of depletion that comes from constantly pushing against limits, deadlines, and expectations that feel, at times, genuinely unreasonable. The Stoics didn't use the word burnout, but they had extensive teaching about a closely related phenomenon, the exhaustion that comes specifically from fighting against reality, rather than working skillfully within it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting the things to which circumstances bind you, rather than expending enormous energy wishing your actual circumstances were different than they currently are. This isn't passive resignation about genuinely changeable circumstances. It's a specific discipline about not adding unnecessary suffering through resistance to things that, at least in this current moment, are simply what they are. Think about the specific exhaustion of constantly wishing your workload were different, your deadlines were more reasonable, your circumstances were fundamentally other than what they currently are, while also, simultaneously, still having to do the actual work in front of you regardless. That combination, doing difficult work while also fighting against its difficulty internally, tends to produce far more exhaustion than doing the same difficult work while accepting its current reality. This distinction matters enormously for modern burnout, where change is genuinely possible, negotiating workload, setting boundaries, seeking different circumstances. Stoic philosophy fully supports that action. But where change isn't immediately possible, continuing to fight internally against unchangeable current reality adds a specific, unnecessary layer of exhaustion on top of whatever the actual circumstances already require. Epictetus taught that accepting current reality, even difficult reality, while still acting skillfully within it, produces far less suffering than simultaneously doing the difficult work while also internally resisting that it's happening at all. Consider your own current sources of burnout. Which parts are genuinely changeable, warranting direct action to address them? And which parts, at least in this current moment, simply require acceptance, so that your energy can go toward doing the actual work skillfully, rather than being split between the work itself and internal resistance to its existence. Have you noticed that accepting a difficult circumstance, even without changing it, often reduces the exhaustion of dealing with it, simply by eliminating the additional layer of internal fighting against its reality? So how do you practice this? First, distinguish clearly between burnout sources that are genuinely changeable and those that, currently, require acceptance rather than continued internal resistance. Second, for changeable sources, take direct action rather than simply enduring them while wishing they were different. And finally, for currently unchangeable sources, practice the specific discipline of acceptance, not giving up on eventual change, but releasing the additional exhaustion of fighting against current reality while still having to function within it. Number 8. We've covered 7 distinctly modern challenges today, and in each case, wisdom written 2,000 years ago provided a genuinely useful framework for addressing them. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't simply that Stoic philosophy happens to be flexible enough to apply anywhere. It's because the Stoics were addressing something more fundamental than any specific technology, circumstance, or historical moment. They were addressing the basic architecture of human psychology, how minds create suffering through resistance, comparison, and attachment to things outside our control, regardless of the specific form those things take in any given era. Every generation faces new versions of the same underlying challenges. New technology creates new forms of comparison, new forms of urgency, new forms of information overload. But underneath the specific modern form, The fundamental human experience remains remarkably consistent, the same tendency toward comparison. The same struggle with things outside our control. The same exhaustion from fighting against reality rather than working skillfully within it. This is exactly why Stoic philosophy has survived, essentially unchanged in its core principles. For 2,000 years, while countless other frameworks, trends, and philosophies have come and gone, it was never really about ancient Rome specifically. It was about the human mind, which hasn't fundamentally changed nearly as much as our technology and circumstances have. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately, with no expectation that his journal would ever be read by anyone else, captured something universal enough that people 2,000 years later, dealing with problems he could never have imagined specifically, still find his insights directly applicable to their actual daily struggles. Consider how many self-help frameworks, productivity systems, and psychological trends have risen and fallen over just the past few decades. While Stoic philosophy has remained consistently relevant, applied by each new generation to whatever specific challenges that generation happens to face. This suggests something worth sitting with. The specific challenges you're facing right now: comparison, connectivity, information overload, decision fatigue, the pressure to excel everywhere simultaneously, digital reputation, burnout. These are simply the current form of challenges humans have always faced. Dressed in modern clothing, and the tools for addressing them, developed 2,000 years ago by people who never could have imagined smartphones or social media, remain genuinely useful precisely because they addressed the underlying human patterns, not the specific technological forms those patterns happen to take in any particular era. So here's what to carry forward from everything we've discussed today. First, remember that whatever specific modern challenge you're facing, it likely has an underlying pattern the Stoics already identified and addressed, even if the specific form is new. Second, apply the same fundamental principles, separating events from stories, focusing on what's within your control, practicing acceptance where change isn't currently possible, regardless of whether the challenge involves ancient circumstances or modern technology. And finally, trust that this philosophy has already survived 2,000 years of changing circumstances precisely because it addresses something more permanent than any specific era's particular problems. Ancient wisdom, applied to distinctly modern problems. That's not a stretch or a forced connection. It's exactly what Stoic philosophy was always designed to do. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus were never really writing about ancient Rome specifically. They were writing about the human mind, its tendencies, its patterns, its capacity for both suffering and steadiness, regardless of the specific circumstances surrounding it. Whatever modern challenge is currently weighing on you, there's a strong chance these same principles, tested for 2,000 years across every kind of circumstance imaginable, can offer you something genuinely useful. If this helped you see your own modern struggles through a clearer lens, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. We release new Stoic philosophy content every week, built for exactly this, ancient wisdom, applied directly to modern life. And in the comments, tell me which of today's 7 modern challenges hit closest to home for you. I'd genuinely like to know. Until next time, the wisdom is old. The application is entirely current.